At dawn, a thin layer of mist rolled across the airfields of eastern Poland. The countryside was silent until a low, vibrating hum began to build from the horizon. It wasn't the thunderous roar of old jet engines or the echoing boom of afterburners. It was quieter, sharper, almost spectral. The kind of sound that didn't come from what you could see, but from something you couldn't. And when the sun finally rose over the tarmac, the outlines became clear. Dozens of F-35 Lightning II stealth fighters, lined in near-perfect formation, their metallic skin glinting faintly under the dawn light. For Poland, it was a breathtaking sight. For Russia, it was an alarm bell ringing at full volume. Hours later, Washington confirmed what open-source analysts had already noticed from satellite imagery. A large deployment of U.S. F-35 seconds had landed overnight at the Powidz and Lask air bases. The aircraft had arrived under the cover of darkness, ferried by a stream of C-17 Globemasters and KC-46 tankers. Ground crews had worked through the night, unloading mobile command units, radar equipment, and portable refueling systems. By morning, the airfields had transformed into forward operating hubs. It was all choreographed, deliberate, and meticulously timed. This wasn't a show of presence. It was a message, a clear, unmistakable statement directed at Moscow. NATO's skies are not yours to threaten. For Russia's defense networks, the first signs were strange blips on radar screens near Kaliningrad and Belarus. Operators assumed at first it was interference, random ghost signals appearing and vanishing without a trace. But then came a pattern, wave after wave of low-signature aircraft, flying at altitudes that made conventional detection almost impossible. Within minutes, commanders realized what they were seeing: stealth. Not prototypes, not simulations, real American F-35 seconds, already operational, already mapping every electronic signature on the western edge of Russian territory. Inside the Kremlin's Defense Control Center, the tone changed from curiosity to disbelief. Generals who once mocked stealth technology as a Western illusion now stared at screens filled with gaps where targets should be. The S-400 batteries deployed in Kaliningrad tried to lock on, but every radar sweep returned empty air. The vaunted F-35 killer system couldn't even confirm that the jets were there. For years, Russia had built its strategy on visibility, on intimidating the world with parades of tanks, missile convoys, and loud threats. The United States had just countered with silence, and that silence was deafening. On Polish soil, the reaction was very different. Locals living near the air bases described a scene that felt more like a movie than a military operation. The night sky flickered with distant silhouettes of cargo planes, their landing lights gliding through fog like comets. Convoys of fuel trucks rolled down back roads under armed escort. By morning, the roads leading to the bases were lined with spectators. Farmers, families, schoolchildren. They stood in the cold, waving flags as the jets taxied across the runways, their stealthy gray forms shimmering against the pale sunrise. To them, the sound of engines wasn't threatening, it was reassuring. It meant NATO hadn't forgotten them. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. A century ago, Poland was carved apart by invading empires. In the Cold War, it stood as a frontline buffer between East and West. Now, for the first time in living memory, the most advanced aircraft ever built were flying to protect Polish skies, not to conquer them. As one local newspaper put it, the ghosts of history have returned, but this time, they are ours. Inside Moscow, the mood was the opposite of celebration. Military advisors warned that this was not just another rotation of forces, it was the opening move of a long-term posture shift. The F-35 seconds were not symbolic. They were practical tools of deterrence. Each one could act as a flying sensor hub, feeding live intelligence into NATO's integrated command grid. That meant every radar pulse, every armored vehicle engine, every heat signature along Russia's western flank was now under constant watch. For the first time in decades, Russia's generals realized they were not the hunters, they were being hunted. And it wasn't the roar of the jets that terrified them. It was their silence. Because when power moves without sound, it means it's already one step ahead. Within 48 hours, the operation evolved beyond anything Europe had seen since the end of the Cold War. What NATO described as a rotational training mission quickly transformed into a fully networked forward presence. The F-35 seconds were not just aircraft. They were nodes in a web, a living, breathing combat cloud connecting every NATO asset from Norway to Romania. Each Lightning II gathered electronic intelligence, radar mapping, and communication intercepts, feeding the data in real time to ground control and partner aircraft. From space, it looked like a constellation of invisible stars orbiting the same mission, deterrence through awareness. In the forest near Białowieża, Polish troops began setting up camouflaged shelters, fuel depots, and emergency runways. Forward arming and refueling points known as FARPs, they were built quietly, fast, and hidden from satellite view under thick tree canopies. These sites allowed stealth jets to land, refuel, and relaunch within minutes, giving them endurance far beyond standard range. It was a move straight out of the U.S. Air Force's playbook for dispersed combat operations, a way to make sure the fleet could never be wiped out in a single strike. For Russia's planners, it was a nightmare scenario. A swarm of invisible aircraft capable of relocating faster than missiles could target them. The Kremlin's intelligence units scrambled to keep up. Intercepts from Belarusian communication towers showed frantic exchanges between radar operators and command posts. Russian S-400 and S-300 systems were repositioned closer to borders. Their search radars switched to wide-angle tracking modes. Electronic warfare brigades rolled out mobile jammers designed to blind incoming drones. But nothing worked as intended. The F-35 seconds adapted instantly, shifting frequencies, rerouting data links, and reappearing on different vectors. Moscow's technology was powerful but outdated in a fight against algorithms built to learn on the fly. Meanwhile, NATO's coordination was seamless. US F-35 seconds operated in tandem with Dutch and Norwegian units already familiar with the Baltic terrain. British Typhoons provided escort coverage, while Polish F-16 seconds acted as local defense patrols. AWACS planes circled high above, their radar domes scanning every sector of the Suwałki Gap. The narrow 65-mile corridor linking Poland and Lithuania, considered NATO's most vulnerable choke point. Every few minutes, encrypted communications pulsed across the network. Altitude, weather, fuel status, radar sweeps. It was an orchestra of precision, invisible yet perfectly synchronized. In the towns nearby, life went on with a strange calm. Locals had grown used to the faint vibrations that passed through their windows at dawn. Children could tell the difference between an old MiG flying overhead and the barely audible hum of a stealth jet. Farmers began joking that the angels of the East were watching over them. But on the other side of the border, the tone was grim. Russian social media channels lit up with rumors of NATO ghosts patrolling the skies, of radars failing to pick up targets, of command centers flooded with false positives. A new word entered their vocabulary: invisible siege. Inside NATO headquarters in Brussels, the messaging was deliberate. Officials spoke calmly, emphasizing defensive readiness and allied cooperation. Yet every image released to the press carried the same psychological weight: rows of F-35 seconds under Polish sunlight, ground crews waving flags, commanders smiling beside the aircraft. It was not provocation, it was narrative warfare. Every photograph was designed to remind Moscow that deterrence wasn't just a military act, it was theater, and NATO now owned the stage. By midweek, Russia's foreign ministry issued formal protests, warning of unpredictable consequences. The phrase was meant to sound threatening, but the world had heard it too many times before. Behind closed doors, intelligence leaks painted a different reality: panic. The Kremlin knew that the F-35 seconds could do more than fly unseen. They could see everything, from artillery positions to moving convoys, from radar emissions to radio chatter. Nothing escaped the Lightning II's digital gaze. In an age where data is dominance, the US had just positioned the ultimate surveillance weapon right on Russia's doorstep. For the United States, it was about more than defense. It was about reclaiming psychological initiative. After years of reacting to Russian provocations from Crimea to Donbass, from Syria to cyberspace, Washington had flipped the script. The message was simple: the age of unchecked aggression was over. NATO was no longer waiting for Russia to act first. It was already there, already watching, and ready to respond before the first shot was fired. The balance of fear had shifted, and everyone could feel it. By the seventh day, the deployment had turned into a full-scale geopolitical standoff. Russian state television ran continuous footage of missile drills, trying to project confidence. News anchors spoke of readiness, of new counter-stealth capabilities, of tests of national resolve. But the bravado couldn't hide the truth. Russian logistics were stretched thin. its air force exhausted by long operations over Ukraine, its economy bleeding from sanctions. Behind closed doors, internal reports admitted to fuel shortages, maintenance backlogs, and pilot rotations across multiple combat zones. The machine looked formidable, but its gears were grinding down. NATO, on the other hand, was only tightening its formation. Under Operation Silent Thunder, F-35 seconds from multiple nations began coordinated low-altitude drills across Poland and Lithuania. On the ground, U.S. HIMARS launchers and Polish Patriot missile crews practiced live-fire synchronization with the stealth jets. Each exercise was filmed, edited, and released with cinematic precision. The tone wasn't boastful, it was confident, controlled, and clear. To Russia, it said, "You are not the only one who can mobilize." To Europe, it whispered reassurance. The alliance still breathes. The F-35 seconds themselves became symbols of modern deterrence. Unlike bombers that rely on shock and awe, they deter by presence, by existing everywhere and nowhere at once. Their pilots, known as the Ghost Riders, flew missions that often ended without a single radar lock or missile fired. They didn't need to engage. Their visibility alone, or rather, their selective invisibility, was enough to keep Russia guessing. Every time a radar flickered, every time a sensor caught an unexplained signal, commanders wondered, is it one of them? Is it here now? The psychological strain of uncertainty became its own form of warfare. In Moscow, Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu convened an emergency meeting at the National Defense Control Center. The agenda was blunt: establish new doctrine for counter-stealth warfare. Generals debated the use of high-altitude observation balloons, infrared triangulation, and massive electronic jamming grids. But even the most optimistic officers knew the reality: no system could neutralize what it couldn't see. Stealth wasn't just a technology, it was a concept. A redefinition of how power moves, how it hides, and how it dictates the pace of confrontation. And right now, Russia was several steps behind. As the tension grew, Western analysts began to outline possible escalation scenarios. The first, airspace provocation, a close encounter between Russian and NATO jets gone wrong. The second, electronic retaliation, where Moscow could flood the airwaves with jamming to blind NATO's communications. The third, proxy maneuvers through Belarusian forces conducting defensive drills near Polish borders. And finally, cyber warfare: silent, invisible, and deniable attacks against energy grids, airports, and logistics hubs. Each option carried the same risk: miscalculation, the wrong radar lock, the wrong intercept, and Europe could be staring at its first open conflict in generations. Yet, through it all, Washington stood firm. Pentagon briefings emphasized calm determination. The U.S. wasn't looking for escalation, but it was prepared for every outcome. Additional aircraft were reportedly on standby in Germany and the Netherlands. Norway offered refueling support. Finland, now fully integrated into NATO command structures, opened its northern airfields for joint exercises. The ring around Russia's western frontier was no longer theoretical, it was physical, operational, and awake. In the midst of global tension, the human side of the mission remained the quiet anchor. F-35 pilots rarely spoke publicly, but those who did shared a sentiment that echoed beyond military circles. "You feel the responsibility," one said, "because when you're flying 30,000 feet above the border, every move matters. You are both the shield and the spark." Their words carried the weight of history. The same skies that once witnessed invasions now sheltered the defenders. The ghosts of Europe's past were finally at peace, guarded by invisible wings. For Poland, the meaning ran even deeper. Generations had lived under the shadow of larger powers now. That shadow belonged to protection, not fear. Children pointed at the faint glints in the sky, calling them angels. Veterans stood in silence, tears in their eyes, as the hum of the F-35 seconds rolled across the plains. It was more than deterrence. It was dignity restored. By the end of the week, Russia found itself in a position it hadn't faced in decades: reactive, uncertain, and surrounded by a technology it couldn't fully comprehend. The Kremlin could bluster, but it couldn't deny the truth. NATO's eyes were open, and they were staring straight back. The game had changed. The era of loud threats and visible parades was giving way to a new kind of power: quiet, intelligent, omnipresent. As the final rays of sunlight faded over Kaliningrad, Russian radar screens glowed with static. struggling to separate ghosts from reality. In that moment, somewhere deep inside Moscow's command bunkers, a single question echoed through the noise. If these jets are already this close and we can't see them, what happens next?